This presentation covers Chapter 4 of Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's The Predictioneer's Game, Bombs Away. On the face of it, this chapter is about the negotiations to disarm North Korea. However, what it does, it really presents the basic forecasting model, right? The very simple one that I think is so important because it is simple and accessible. So Bruce lays out the 4 steps for forecasting a decision. If we want to figure out what's going to happen in a negotiation with a group of people, first we have to identify the players. Every individual or group that has a meaningful interest in influencing the outcome. You could also think of these as the stakeholders. The important thing is not to just focus on the final decision makers. It's like everybody who's got a dog in this fight and might bring some influence to bear has to be identified. These are the players. Then for each of the players, you estimate their position, and very often what Bruce does is creates a unidimensional decision, right? It goes from 0 to 100, and it's a policy scale, one dimension to make a decision on this, and you rank or you order different positions based on, the 2 extremes, right? It's kind of this idea of a left-right spectrum, however you want to put it. There's some underlying ordering to the different positions. And so you figure out, though, what each player's most preferred position is. What is we could call this their ideal point, their preferred position, their most preferred outcome, their interest, but you place them as, what is the position they're advocating for? What are they trying to get? Then for each player, you approximate the salience. Okay, how big an issue is this for each of the players? How much are they going to focus on this, or are they going to worry about other issues, right? Other things might be more important. So there's their ideal position, how much what their salience is for that position, and finally, approximate the power, right? What is their influence? Sometimes Bruce calls this clout, right? But we're talking about how much power a player has over others, right? And Bruce talks about this as, being able to apply persuasive power, right? Can you persuade others to change their position? And that goes into, your material resources. What can you do to get people to move? And so these are the 4 elements, right? If you identify the players and then estimate their position, their salience, and their power, with that information, this is what you need to make the first cut, the basic prediction. Throughout the chapter, Bruce makes some comments about this methodology. First of all, he looks at these inputs. He says, look, they seem slim, but they are the crucial bits of information. These are what you need. If you don't have them, you aren't going to make a good prediction. And he says, look, could you bring in other aspects? Sure. And more information can help. But this is what he says is the minimal, crucial information. And when he gets into more, when you get to bigger permutations, more players, it's a lot of information. It can be, so in a sense, you do want to keep it small, but minimal, crucial information. I think this is something that's important about theories. They filter information for us. That can be problematic, but it's also critical in order to make predictions and assess the world. Inputs can be estimated. He says, look, these things can be difficult. There's I don't want to say subjective aspect to it, but you have to estimate. You're guessing at some level. You're taking your best shot at a lot of these things. And he says, you can do this, right? You can go and look. And I always look at it as, hey, you're reducing it down to a simple question, right? And what's this player's ideal position? And you just treat that, and here again, it's an empirical question. We aren't saying, okay, this is what leaders are. And that's in his discussion of Kim and his decision making and his position. Bruce will talk about how he says, well, leaders probably do mainly care about surviving. So in estimating the individual position, there is sometimes an assumption at work. Ontological assumptions rear their ugly heads, but also there isn't necessarily, right? It's subjective, it's a subjective judgment of empirical fact, what each player's, position, power, and such are. And sometimes by restricting to that simple question, you can in fact do a fairly good job of estimating. Now, Bruce makes a lot of his money, or a lot of his efforts go into using expert inputs, right? He says, look, if you want answers to what each player's, position, power, etc. is, go to experts, right? This is what they know. They can answer these questions. They can provide the inputs. And this is what he frequently does. He comes into a situation, tries to find experts on, subject matter experts to get the inputs. And then he puts them in the model and makes his prediction. By the way, the experts don't like this. I've talked to people who've been on that, and a lot of times the area experts are really not happy when they get quizzed to provide the inputs, but they're a good source of inputs. Expert and non-expert estimates often converge. And this is what he goes through several times in the book. He says, we get the experts with maybe access to classified information, and they make one set of estimates. And then I get, at one point, undergrads to estimate on this, and, using economist articles, and they're pretty close. Right? This is one of the things he says, that very often two experts who might have, very different predictions about what will happen will nevertheless converge and make the same estimates of these 4 points. And also expert versus non-experts often have the same thing. So he says it's kind of surprising, but hey, we even though people are making judgment calls, especially with things like power and salience, and they are nevertheless kind of converging on similar answers. And he also says, hey, look, the model predicts better with the expert's input, right? If you take the expert's input, the model predicts better than the experts do. And he says, look, experts are experts in their field. They're not experts in the process. They aren't experts in predicting the decision making. That's what he's an expert in, but he needs the input. He needs the empirical input to run the model. And this is the synergy, right? Is you bring the model together with the people who are experts on the players and the situation, and you get better predictions. Now, in terms of estimating positions, right? We've got here's from the book, kind of how he did it, right? He says, look, a simple estimate he simplifies, in the book he presents a simplified North Korean example. And he says, look, here we have a dimension from 0 to 100. At one end, there's no negotiations over North Korean disarmament. Nothing happens. And then a little ways up, there's Kim, what he identifies as Kim's position. Yeah, let's make an agreement and then cheat on it, right? I don't want to have no negotiation. Let's see what I can get, and then I'll cheat. At the other end of the scale, we have Bush, who's like, he needs to just eliminate his nuclear weapons. I don't want to give him anything for doing it. And in between, we have a bunch of other positions that, get, as you move from left to right, they're less favorable to Kim. They're, less of a reduction, and, towards the left. As you move to the right, the reductions get bigger, and the concessions from the U.S. get smaller. And so this is the rank ordering that he comes up with of the different outcomes. And you have this numerical scale that he says, again, you estimate this. The next step, right? So what the previous slide was basically steps 1 and 2, right? Identifying the players and identifying their position. Here are the estimates of power, right? So if we have people at these positions, right, and we don't have the names of the people here, but we have 5 different groups, 5 different players with power, each with this position. And if you have two players at the same position with the same, you add their power because they might as well just be a group, right? But the thing is, though, or you can have a stacked thing, but he calls these the mountains of power, right? And each bar represents the percentage of power. It adds up to 100, right? How much power does everyone have? It all adds up to 100. So it's the percentage of persuasive power that each player has. And he says, the way you come up with the power majority prediction, right? I often like to think of it as the median position prediction, but you find the policy position where 50% of the power is on one side and 50% is on the other. That's why I like median, or where you have majorities on either side. And in this case, it's the middle position, but not the middle position on the policy spectrum. It's the middle position given the distribution of power. This is the position where 50% of the power is on one side and 50% on the other. And he found in this example that eliminate the nuclear program with concessions from the US was the position in the middle. And this is your first prediction. This is the position that if we were voting, right, on this, where it would be the position that any move away from that position would be to the detriment of more than 50% of the power, right? So this is his prediction of the likely thing. And this is using basically like median voter theorem and that sort of thing. So this is the first prediction we have. Now, he does note this is ignoring the fact that Bush and Kim have a veto, and that makes it a little more complicated. So this simple model does not take into account potential veto power on any particular player. And in this model, in this situation, you would expect that both Kim and Bush have a veto. They can just not agree, right? And then we don't have an agreement. So that is a complicating factor that we're going to ignore for now. Okay, the next prediction is slightly different from the power majority one. This is a weighted mean. And basically, we're going to add salience in here. We're going to arithmetically calculate the position, right? And so basically what you do is for each player, you take their power, right, which we'll call influence, multiply it times their salience, and by their position, because remember we have a number from 0 to 100 for their position. And so we're basically taking, for each player, power times or influence, right, times salience times position, and we add them all up. And then you divide by the sum of influence times salience for everybody, right? So and we thus get a weighted mean, right? We're going to get a weighted mean of position on there, right? So if you do that, and all right, it's a little math, but you get a weighted mean that takes into account salience. What's this look like? Okay, if we go back to figure 4.1, Bruce says in his example that he can calculate a weighted mean at 59.8. Now recall that the power majority position was up there, closer to 80, right? And so we've got a difference, right? By factoring in salience, the position moved down a ways, right? And so we get a slightly different outcome when we put into the mix, hey, okay, yeah, these people have power. How much do they care about this position? Where do we go? And we see that the outcome moves a bit towards Kim's side of things, right? So, but it's, this is just a different prediction. So now we have two predictions. And what he says that you want to do here is think of this as a range, right? Okay, we're going to find an outcome somewhere in there, right? That's a prediction. And he argues that this is the 70 to 75% solution, that based on his research, just doing this much is going to get, you're going to be right 70, 75% of the time, right? Now, it's an estimate. It's a range of outcomes. It's only 70 to 75% good, but hey, that's not bad. So right now, just by applying these simple steps, you can come up with a fairly decent prediction. And you can also, I think, get an ability to conceive and can visualize the moving parts and the situation to get an understanding. I think that this is still intuitive enough. We haven't gone into complete math, complete computer simulation. We're still thinking about things, but in a structured way that is giving, I would argue, some analytical insight as well. So that's why I kind of like this as a method to teach students and to have in one's toolbox. Now, Bruce does a lot of computer simulations, and so we have some interesting questions that are kind of begged by this. First of all, he did say, hey, look, I'm not factoring in the question of vetoes, so that we don't have, it's not a negotiation amongst equals, right? And we do have people with vetoes, Kim and Bush. And so you have to approach them. How do you get them to move their position towards the middle? This involves a question of sequences of moves, right? And scenarios and evaluating them. What will work? Can we have someone make an offer to the US and then bring that back over? And that is all modeled through an extensive form game that he has and he introduces later. So we will put a pin in that for the moment, I think. But that is where you can get beyond the 70 to 75% model. How does this work, right? Well, I don't really know, right? The simulations are there. We can do the math, we can quantify things, and but in terms of doing the simulations, those are, he has the model and he refers to it and he says, well, we can do this, and he will talk about it. But there is always a certain, off-stage thing, and so in some ways it's kind of a black box, right? However, like I say, as you get into it more, you can. He does provide a lot of information later about how this works, but for now we're going to leave it alone. The question, though, that I think sometimes comes up: is it a black box or a hand wave? Bruce introduced the concept of a hand wave. He says, hey, look, whenever anyone says it stands to reason, he calls that a hand wave, and a lot of people call that's a term that I've seen used in a lot of cases, where, all right, we're not gonna logically go through the steps. We're just gonna say they're self-evident, right? And so it stands to reason. I know students like to say history shows, and it's like, does it really? And so there's that question of, is this a hand wave? And a lot of times when you have the unobserved, right? When you don't go through every step of the process, and sometimes you can go through every step. A lot of formal theory is plagued by the fact that people don't want to go through the math, right? And so for some people, the math is a black box, right? Where you go in and you come out with an answer. And now the thing is, people who know math go in the black box, right? And they go along and they make sure that everything's working the way that it's being said to work. But this is the question: is with these theories and with these papers, especially in game theory and formal theory, for a lot of people it becomes a black box, and they say, I've had people complain, oh, we get these answers and we have no idea where they came from. It's like, well, actually, it's all written down there if you would just take the time. And that is something that I feel is unfair, right? When people treat it like it's a hand wave. On the other hand, we do have the problem of there is a certain proprietariness to Bruce's computer simulations. And so he keeps a couple things off. Right, and he talks about his students will have access to the computer, and we're kind of left wondering about it. And so that is something that there is a black box component when you're using this book, when you're reading it, and you try to read between the lines. I don't know, maybe I'm just not smart enough to read completely between the lines, but there is that there. And my point, though, is that it isn't a hand wave because the work has been done. We don't necessarily see all the work. And the point of this book is not to give you a lot of math, right? And so you can't complain, oh, you aren't giving me all the details. It's like, well, you don't want the details. You can't handle the math. right? Would be with apologies to the movie, but that is, I think, part of what goes on here, and people might have trouble with that, but key thing is this chapter has introduced the basic model that is, I think, fairly accessible and gives you a good understanding, and therefore, even without the computer simulation, is quite useful.